The jackhammer's roar echoed through the suburban morning as Karen Whitfield stormed across her pristine lawn, cell phone pressed to her ear. 911? Yes, I need to report a crime in progress. Her voice cracked with hysteria as she pointed at her neighbor's backyard where contractors were filling in an old swimming pool. The operator's confused silence stretched on until Karen screamed, "They're destroying property! This is vandalism." But when two patrol officers arrived, expecting a domestic dispute, they found something that made their blood run cold. Not a crime scene, but a woman so consumed by neighborhood warfare that she'd lost all grip on reality. What they discovered in Karen's own backyard would expose a web of lies, obsession, and a dark secret that would shatter everything the quiet cul-de-sac thought they knew about there. The jackhammer's violent percussion shattered the morning calm of Maple Grove Lane at exactly 7:47 a.m., sending tremors through the foundation of every house on the cul-de-sac. Karen Whitfield's coffee mug slipped from her manicured fingers, ceramic exploding against her kitchen's marble floor in a spray of dark liquid and white fragments. "What, in God's name?" she breathed, rushing to her bay window. Through the pristine glass, she watched in horror as three burly contractors in hard hats systematically destroyed what had once been the crown jewel of 1247. Maple Grove Lane, the Hendersons' kidney-shaped swimming pool. The pool had been there for 15 years, a constant source of irritation for Karen. Not because of noise, the Hendersons were actually quiet neighbors, but because it was perfect. Crystal blue water that never seemed to need cleaning, elegant stone coping that put her own concrete pool deck to shame, and underwater lighting that cast romantic ripples across their backyard during summer evenings. Karen had spent countless hours at this very window, watching the Henderson family's pool parties, their children's birthday celebrations, their anniversary dinners on the patio. Watching their happiness with the bitter taste of envy coating her tongue, and now they were destroying it. "No," Karen whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "No, no, no. They can't just." The jackhammer roared again, chunks of concrete flying as the lead contractor, a weathered man with graying temples, attacked the pool's edge with mechanical precision. Behind him, two younger men operated a small excavator, its bucket teeth scraping against the pool's bottom with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. Karen's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Her fingers, adorned with perfectly manicured nails painted in coral sunset, fumbled with the device. The screen lit up, displaying her wallpaper. A photo of herself at the Maple Grove Homeowners Association annual meeting, accepting a plaque for outstanding community service. She'd been the HOA president for 3 consecutive terms, a position she'd leveraged to maintain the neighborhood's standards, property values, and most importantly, her own sense of control. But this was chaos. She speed-dialed Margaret Chen, her second in command at the HOA, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Margaret, it's Karen. Emergency, call me back immediately. The Hendersons are destroying their pool without proper permits. This is a violation of at least 6 community regulations. Call me." The jackhammer continued its assault. Karen watched the lead contractor pause, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool October morning. He was methodical, professional. This wasn't random destruction, it was planned, permitted, legal. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She dialed the county building department, her voice shaking as she navigated the automated system. Building permits. Residential, ... pool removal. County building department. "This is Jessica. Yes, I need to verify if there's a permit. For pool removal at 1247 Maple Grove Lane. Hold, please." Karen's reflection stared back at her from the window, a woman in her late 40s with salon-perfect blonde hair, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that cost more than most people's monthly car payment. She'd worked hard for this life, this house, this neighborhood. She'd married well, invested wisely, and fought tooth and nail to maintain the standards that kept Maple Grove Lane the most desirable address in Westfield Township. "Ma'am, yes, there's a valid permit issued 3 weeks ago. Permit number." Karen hung up without listening to the rest. Her hands shook as she stared at the destruction unfolding in her neighbor's backyard. 3 weeks. They'd been planning this for 3 weeks and hadn't said a word. Not a word to her, the HOA president, the person responsible for maintaining community standards. The betrayal cut deep. The Hendersons had moved in 12 years ago, a young couple with twin toddlers and dreams of suburban bliss. Karen had welcomed them with a fruit basket and a carefully curated folder of neighborhood guidelines. She'd watched their children grow up in that pool, watched them host family gatherings, watched them live the kind of effortless happiness that seemed to elude her own family. Her husband Richard worked 80-hour weeks at his law firm. Their own children were grown and rarely visited, and their pool installed at great expense 3 years ago remained largely unused except for the occasional business entertainment. Karen had hosted exactly 2 pool parties, both stiff affairs with clients and neighbors who seemed more interested in the imported Italian tiles than in actually swimming. But the Hendersons' pool was different. It was alive, it was loved, and now it was being murdered. She smoothed her sweater and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror before opening the door to find Tom Henderson standing on her portico. His usual easy smile replaced by something more cautious. "Morning, Karen. I wanted to give you a heads up about the noise today. Should be done by afternoon." Tom was everything Karen's husband wasn't present: engaged, genuinely kind. He coached Little League, organized neighborhood barbecues, and had never once complained about Karen's frequent HOA emails about minor infractions. He was wearing work clothes, jeans, and a faded university sweatshirt, and his hands were dirty. From helping with the pool removal, Tom, Karen said, her voice carefully controlled, "I wasn't aware you were planning such a significant renovation. Not really a renovation, more like making room for Linda's garden expansion. She's been wanting to grow vegetables for years, and with the kids away at college now, ... double quotes, he shrugged. Seemed like the right time. Linda's garden expansion." Karen felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. Linda Henderson was already the neighborhood's unofficial master gardener. Her front yard a riot of seasonal flowers that made Karen's professionally landscaped beds look sterile by comparison. Now she was expanding into the backyard, claiming the space where the pool had been. "I see," Karen said. "And you didn't think to discuss this with the HOA first?" "There are procedures, Tom, standards to maintain." Something flickered across Tom's face, a flash of irritation quickly suppressed. "Karen, it's our property. We pulled the proper permits, checked with the city. Everything's legal." "Legal doesn't mean appropriate," Karen replied, her voice rising slightly. "This is a pool neighborhood, Tom. Property values depend on maintaining certain amenities. You're destroying something that adds value to the entire community." The jackhammer roared again, punctuating her words. Tom glanced back at his house, then returned his attention to Karen with a patience that felt almost condescending. "I understand your concern, but this is what's best for our family. The pool's been expensive to maintain, and we're not using it anymore. Linda's excited about the garden, and honestly, we're looking forward to having a lower-maintenance backyard." Lower maintenance. The words hit Karen like a slap. She'd spent thousands on pool maintenance, on professional landscaping, on maintaining the kind of backyard that would photograph well for real estate listings. The Hendersons were walking away from all of that for vegetables. "Tom, you have to understand, I have to get back," he interrupted gently. "The guys want to finish the concrete removal today. Thanks for understanding about the noise." He turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing in her doorway, watching him disappear into his house. The jackhammer resumed its work, each impact reverberating through her bones. She closed the door and leaned against it, her breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't just about the pool. It was about respect, about community standards, about the careful order she'd spent years building. The Hendersons were destroying more than concrete and tiles. They were destroying the very foundation of what made Maple Grove Lane special. Karen returned to her kitchen window, watching the contractors work. The pool was half gone now, its elegant curves reduced to jagged concrete edges and exposed rebar. It looked like a war zone, like something had been bombed from orbit. Her phone rang, Margaret Chen finally returning her call. "Karen, I got your message. What's this about the Hendersons? They're destroying their pool, Margaret, right now, without any community consultation, without considering the impact on property values, without do they have permits? That's not the point," Karen's voice cracked. "The point is they're destroying something beautiful, something that benefits the entire neighborhood. This is exactly the kind of selfish decision-making that undermines everything we've worked for." There was a pause on TH. 3 days after the pool's destruction, Karen stood in her home office, surrounded by printouts, photographs, and a growing collection of evidence that would prove Linda Henderson's garden project was nothing more than a calculated power grab. The mahogany desk that had once held Richard's law books now resembled a war room, complete with a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood marked with colored pins indicating allies, enemies, and undecided. Margaret Chen sat across from her, looking increasingly uncomfortable as Karen outlined her findings. "Look at this," Karen said, sliding a photograph across the desk. "I took this yesterday morning. See how she's positioned the compost bins? They're deliberately facing the Kowalski's kitchen window. And here," she pointed to another photo. "The tool shed is blocking the Yamamoto's view of their rose garden." Margaret studied the images with the weary expression of someone who'd been dragged into a conflict she didn't understand. "Karen, they're compost bins. Where else would she put them? It's psychological warfare, Margaret. She's marking territory, establishing dominance. The woman is trying to turn our neighborhood into some kind of commune." The transformation of the Henderson backyard had been swift and thorough. Within 48 hours of the pool's removal, Linda had hired a different, crude young, tattooed landscapers who arrived in a truck covered with environmental bumper stickers. They'd filled the pool's crater with rich, dark soil, installed raised beds in perfect geometric patterns, and erected a small greenhouse that gleamed like a crystal palace in the morning sun. Karen had documented every stage of the process, from her kitchen window, taking photos at 30-minute intervals, like a surveillance operation. The images now covered her desk in overlapping layers of evidence of what she'd begun to think of as the Henderson conspiracy. "She's recruiting neighbors," Karen continued, pulling out a notebook filled with her careful handwriting. "Yesterday, I saw Mrs. Patterson from Oak Street carrying a basket of what looked like seed packets. The Nguyen family brought over their twins to help with something. And this morning, I watched David Sterling actually helping them install an irrigation system." David Sterling was the neighborhood's most eligible bachelor, a successful architect who'd moved to Maple Grove Lane 6 months ago. Karen had noticed him immediately: tall, dark-haired, with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to worry about money or social status. She'd invited him to 2 HOA meetings and 1 dinner party, but he'd politely declined, each time claiming work commitments. Now he was spending his Saturday morning helping Linda Henderson water lettuce seeds. "Maybe people are just being neighborly," Margaret suggested weakly. "Neighborly?" Karen's voice cracked. "Margaret, when was the last time anyone volunteered to help with one of our HOA initiatives? When was the last time you saw this kind of enthusiasm for maintaining our community standards?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably. People seemed to like the garden idea. "It's ... different. Different." Karen repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Different is exactly the problem. We've spent years creating a cohesive aesthetic, maintaining property values, ensuring that Maple Grove Lane represents stability and quality. Linda Henderson shows up with her organic vegetables, and suddenly everyone's ready to throw that away. The intercom buzzed. Karen pressed the button with more force than necessary. "Mrs. Whitfield." The voice belonged to Consuela, her housekeeper. "There's a woman at the door. Says she's from the garden club." Karen's blood went cold. "Send her to the office." Linda Henderson appeared in the doorway moments later, wearing dirt-stained jeans and a faded t-shirt that read, "Grow Your Own. Paradise." Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face had the kind of healthy glow that came from spending time outdoors. She looked younger than her 52 years, more vibrant than Karen had ever seen her. "Hi, Karen." Margaret Linda's smile was warm but cautious. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Karen said, quickly shuffling the surveillance photos into a stack. "What can I do for you?" Linda stepped into the office, her eyes taking in the expensive furniture, the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the framed certificates, and awards that covered one wall. If she noticed the neighborhood map with its colored pins, she didn't comment. "I wanted to invite you to our garden planning meeting tomorrow afternoon. We're finalizing the plot assignments and discussing the shared tool policy." "Plot assignments." Karen's voice was carefully neutral. "Oh, it's wonderful. We've had so much interest from neighbors wanting their own vegetable plots. The Kowalskis want to grow tomatoes. The Yamamoto family is planning an herb garden. David Sterling, the architect, he's designing a beautiful arbor system for our climbing plants. Karen felt her chest tighten. I see. And who exactly approved this? Expansion. Well, it's our property, Linda said, a note of confusion creeping into her voice. But we're keeping it open to anyone who wants to participate. It's going to be such a wonderful community space. Margaret cleared her throat. It does sound lovely, Linda. Very inclusive. That's exactly what we were hoping for, Linda said, her enthusiasm building. Tom and I have been talking about this for years. When the kids were little, we always dreamed of having a place where neighbors could come together, grow their own food, maybe even host harvest festivals. Now that we have the space, harvest festivals, Karen repeated slowly, in a residential neighborhood. Nothing big, Linda assured her quickly. Just a casual gathering in the fall, maybe some apple cider and pumpkin carving for the kids, a way to celebrate what we've grown together. Karen stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the Henderson backyard. The garden was already taking shaped, neat rows of raised beds, a small greenhouse catching the afternoon light, the framework of what would become a thriving community space. In the distance, she could see Tom Henderson kneeling beside a bed of newly planted lettuce, his hands dark with soil, his face peaceful in a way that made Karen's chest ache with something she couldn't name. Linda's voice was gentle. Are you all right? I'm fine, Karen said without turning around. Just processing all of this. I know it's a big change, Linda said, but change can be good, don't you think? The pool was beautiful, but it was also isolating this way. People can actually use the space, they can contribute to something meaningful. Karen turned back to face her neighbor, her expression carefully controlled, and you'll be managing all of this, the plot assignments, the shared tools, the harvest festivals. Tom and I are coordinating initially, but we're hoping to set up a rotating leadership structure. Maybe different families can take turns organizing activities, managing the composting system, that sort of thing. A rotating leadership structure. Karen felt something cold settle in her stomach. Linda Henderson was creating a parallel governance system, a shadow HOA, based on vegetables and community engagement, instead of property values and aesthetic standards. Well, Karen said finally, it all sounds very ambitious. I hope you'll consider joining us, Linda said. We'd love to have your input, your organizational experience. Maybe you could help us set up some of the administrative systems. The invitation hung in the air like a challenge. Karen could see Margaret watching her carefully, waiting for her response. This was the moment to accept Linda's offer and become a supporting player in someone else's vision. Or I'll think about it, Karen said. Thank you for the invitation. After Linda left, Karen and Margaret sat in silence for several minutes. The afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, chaotic planets. She seems nice, Margaret said finally. She seems calculated, Karen corrected. Did you see how she positioned herself? Standing in the doorway, looking around at my office, taking inventory. And that comment about my organizational experience, like, I'm some kind of middle manager she's considering for a promotion. Maybe she genuinely wants your help. Karen laughed, but there was no humor in it. Margaret, Linda Henderson just spent 15 minutes describing a complete restructuring of neighborhood social dynamics. She's creating events, assigning leadership roles, establishing new traditions. She's not asking for my help, she's offering me a consolation prize. Margaret stood slowly, gathering her purse. I should get home, Bill's expecting dinner. Margaret, Karen's voice stopped her at the door. You're not seriously considering joining this garden thing, are you? Margaret paused, her hand on the doorknob. I don't know, Karen. It might be nice to grow my own tomatoes. After Margaret left, Karen returned to her desk, staring at the photographs spread across its surface. The images told a story of transformation. The ordered beauty of the Henderson pool to the chaotic potential of turned soil and planted seeds. But beneath the surface narrative, Karen saw something else, a systematic dismantling of everything she'd worked to build. Her phone rang. Richard, calling from his office. How was your day? He asked, his voice distracted. She could hear the clicking of his keyboard in the background. Fine, Karen said. The Hendersons are turning their backyard into a community garden. That's nice, good for property values probably. People like that organic stuff these days. The Westfield Community Center had never felt smaller. Karen arrived 30 minutes early, her arms loaded with presentation materials, legal documents, and a laptop loaded with a PowerPoint she'd spent 2 days perfecting. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the institutional gray carpet and folding chairs arranged in neat rows. By 6:45 p.m., the room was packed beyond capacity. Karen had expected maybe 20 neighbors, the usual HOA meeting crowd of retirees and property-obsessed homeowners. Instead, she faced nearly 60 people, including several she didn't recognize. Teenagers leaned against the walls, many holding phones that they weren't bothering. To hide the Hendersons sat in the front row, Linda's face calm but alert, Tom's expression unreadable. Behind them, Karen recognized the coalition she'd been building: Janet Morrison from Elm Street, Mike Patterson, Robert Chen, and a dozen others who'd responded to her email with varying degrees of outrage about the garden project, but scattered. Throughout the crowd were faces that made Karen's stomach clench with uncertainty. Mrs. Kowalski holding a basket of what looked like homemade cookies. The Yamamoto family with their twin daughters, both wearing T-shirts that read "Future Farmers." "Thank you all for coming," Karen began, her voice projecting clearly across the room. "I know Thursday evening isn't convenient for everyone, but the issues we're discussing tonight affect every property owner on Maple Grove Lane." She clicked to her first slide, protecting our community's character and value. Statistics about neighborhood stability and carefully selected photos emphasizing the aesthetic harmony of their cul-de-sac. For over a decade, Maple Grove Lane, Karen continued, her confidence building as she fell into the rhythm of a well-rehearsed speech. This didn't happen by accident, and residents who understand that individual choices affect our entire community. A few heads nodded in agreement. Janet Morrison was taking notes. Robert Chen had his arms crossed in a posture of defensive solidarity. However, Karen clicked to the next slide, which showed a photo of the Hendersons' garden construction. Recent developments threatened to fundamentally alter the character of our neighborhood. The photo was damning, taken at an unflattering angle that emphasized the churned earth and construction equipment. Karen had cropped out the workers' faces, making the scene look more chaotic and destructive than it had in reality. The replacement of a beautiful, valuable swimming pool with agricultural activities raises serious concerns about our community's direction. Are we a residential neighborhood committed to maintaining standards, or are we willing to become something else entirely? What exactly is wrong with growing vegetables? The voice came from the back of the room. Karen looked up to see David Sterling standing with his arms crossed, his expression politely challenging. "Nothing is wrong with gardening, David," Karen replied smoothly, "but there's a difference between personal gardening and transforming private property into what amounts to a public park. The Henderson project includes community plots, shared tools, organized events." "Sounds terrible," interrupted Mrs. Kowalski, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Neighbors actually sharing things and spending time together. How awful." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. Karen felt her carefully planned presentation beginning to slip away from her. "Mrs. Kowalski, I understand your enthusiasm, but we need to consider the broader implications. Property values, liability issues, traffic concerns. Have you actually looked at the garden?" This time it was Sarah Nugent, one of the twins, who couldn't have been more than 16. "It's beautiful. It's bringing people together. Why is that a problem?" Karen stared at the teenager, feeling something fundamental shift in the room's energy. She'd expected opposition from the Hendersons, maybe some pushback from garden enthusiasts. She hadn't prepared for being challenged by children. "Sarah, isn't it?" Karen's voice took on the patronizing tone she used with her own grown children. "I appreciate your perspective, but neighborhood governance involves complex considerations that, like what?" Sarah stood up, her sister Amy joining her. "Like the fact that the Hendersons' pool has been empty for 2 years? Like how nobody ever used it except for taking pictures for real estate websites?" The observation hit like a physical blow. Karen felt heat rising in her cheeks as murmurs ran through the crowd. How did a 16-year-old know about the real estate photos? "The point," Karen said, struggling to regain control, "is that we have established procedures for significant property modifications. The HOA exists, too, to control people." Tom Henderson spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying. Clearly, across the room, "Karen, with all due respect, You've turned neighborhood leadership into a full-time job of finding problems with everything people want to do." "That's not true," Karen protested, but even as she said it, she could see the faces around her shifting. "I work hard to maintain standards that benefit everyone." "Whose standards?" Linda Henderson rose from her seat, turning to address the room rather than Karen. "When we moved here 12 years ago, this was a neighborhood where kids rode their bikes in the street and neighbors borrowed cups of sugar from each other. Now we get emails about grass height and paint color pre-approval and proper holiday decoration protocols. Those protocols maintain property values," Karen said desperately. "They protect everyone's investment." "Investment," David Sterling's voice cut through the rising tension. "Is that what we're calling our homes now? Investments?" Karen looked around the room, seeing her support base crumbling in real time. Janet Morrison was staring at her hands. Mike Patterson looked uncomfortable. Even Robert Chen seemed to be reconsidering his position. Double quotes Karen started, then stopped. The PowerPoint slide behind her showed a graph of property values, but suddenly the numbers felt abstract, meaningless. Mrs. Kowalski stood up, her voice gaining strength. "Where kids can't have birthday parties without worrying about noise complaints. Where neighbors spy on each other and report." "That's not," Karen began, but Mrs. Kowalski wasn't finished. "My husband and I moved here because we wanted community. Instead, we got a homeowners association that treats friendship like a code violation." The room erupted in overlapping conversations. Warnings about unapproved mailbox colors, complaints about the increasingly lengthy list of HOA rules that governed everything from dog walking routes to acceptable landscaping choices. "Please," Karen called out, her voice barely audible above the din. "Please, let's maintain order." "Order," Linda Henderson's voice cut through the chaos like a bell. The room fell silent, every face turning toward her. "Karen, you've spent years talking about order, but what you've really created is isolation. The garden isn't destroying our neighborhood, it's saving it. How can you say that?" Voice cracked. "You destroyed something beautiful, something valuable, something that had been there for 15 years. Something we never used," Tom said gently. "Something that sat empty while our neighbors lived their lives on the other side of fence lines and property boundaries." "But the property values—" "Will be fine," David Sterling interrupted. "Actually, they'll probably improve. Community gardens increase neighborhood desirability in every market analysis I've seen. People want connection. Karen, they want to know their neighbors." Karen felt the room slipping away from her completely. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was the one with experience, with knowledge, with years of successful neighborhood leadership. She was the one who understood what needed to be protected. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising to near desperation. "You don't understand what this neighborhood was like before I started organizing things." Amy Nugent's young voice carried a devastating clarity, because it doesn't feel special for anyone except the people who like making rules. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Karen looked around the room, seeing the faces of neighbors she'd worked with for years. People she'd thought respected her leadership, valued her dedication. Instead, she saw pity, frustration, and something that looked disturbingly like relief. They were relieved to finally challenge her. Her presentation materials suddenly felt like props in a play no one wanted to watch. "I think we should vote." "Vote on what?" Linda asked. "On whether the community garden project should be allowed to continue, not cruelly, but with genuine empathy." Karen's campaign began at 5:32 a.m. on Saturday morning with a certified letter to the city planning department questioning the adequacy of the Hendersons' permit documentation. By 6:15, she'd filed a formal complaint with the township's environmental health division regarding potential groundwater contamination from unregulated composting activities. At 7 o'clock, she submitted a detailed report to the fire marshal about combustible organic material storage in violation of residential safety codes. She worked with the methodical precision of a lawyer building a case, which made sense. Learned from watching Richard dismantle opposing arguments for 23 years, every regulation, every ordinance, every bureaucratic procedure that could possibly apply to the Henderson Garden was researched, documented, and weaponized. Her kitchen window, Karen watched her neighbors arrive for the community workday Linda had organized. They came in waves families with children carrying small gardening tools. elderly couples with folding chairs and thermoses of coffee, teenagers with phones and surprising enthusiasm for manual labor. David Sterling arrived with architectural drawings, spreading blueprints across a folding table as neighbors gathered around to examine his designs for an expanded greenhouse. Karen documented everything: photos of the crowd sizes, license plates of cars parked on the street, timestamps of activities that might constitute commercial assembly in a residential zone. Her notebook filled with evidence that would prove the Henderson garden was exactly the kind of disruptive influence she'd warned against. But as the morning progressed, something unexpected began to gnaw at her focus. The laughter carrying across the fence line was genuine, infectious. Children ran between garden beds with muddy hands and bright faces. Elderly neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other in years worked side by side, sharing tools and stories. Mrs. Kowalski taught a group of teenagers how to properly space tomato plants while their parents installed trellises and discussed watering schedules. It looked like joy. It looked like community. It looked like everything Karen had spent years trying to create through committees and regulations and carefully planned neighborhood events that no one ever seemed excited to attend. The doorbell rang at 11:30. Karen opened it to find Officer Martinez, the same young Hispanic woman who'd responded to her pool destruction report. This time, her expression was weary rather than concerned. "Mrs. Whitfield, we need to talk." Karen led her to the living room, where she'd spread her documentation across the coffee table like a legal brief: photos, printouts, highlighted regulation excerpts, and copies of her various complaints to city departments. "I've been getting calls all morning," Officer Martinez said, settling into the leather armchair across from Karen. "Building department, environmental health, fire marshal. They're all asking about complaints filed against 1247 Maple Grove Lane. I'm exercising my rights as a citizen to ensure proper regulatory compliance," Karen said, her voice steady. "If the Henderson project is legitimately permitted and properly managed, then my complaints will be dismissed. If not, ... Mrs. Whitfield." Officer Martinez leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "What's really going on here? I don't know what you mean. 3 weeks ago, you called 911 because your neighbors removed their swimming pool. Yesterday, you filed 6 separate complaints against the same property. Today, I'm watching 60 people working together in a garden while you're sitting alone in your house building a case against them." Officer Martinez paused. "That doesn't seem normal." Karen felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Normal, Officer Martinez? What's not normal is allowing people to fundamentally alter the character of a residential neighborhood without any oversight or consideration for the community impact." "The character of the neighborhood?" Officer Martinez repeated the phrase thoughtfully. "Mrs. Whitfield, when I drove down your street this morning, I saw neighbors talking to each other, kids playing together, people working on a shared project. That seems like pretty good character to me." "You don't understand," Karen said, her voice tightening. "You don't live here. You don't understand what this place was like, what we've built, what we're losing. Help me understand." Karen stared at the officer, seeing genuine curiosity rather than judgment. For a moment, she was tempted to explain about the years of careful planning, the fight to maintain standards, the way the neighborhood had transformed from a collection of houses into something special. But how could she explain that the thing everyone was celebrating felt like betrayal? How could she make anyone understand that their joy was built on the ruins of her life's work? "The Henderson garden violates multiple city codes," Karen said instead. "I have documentation." Officer Martinez glanced at the papers scattered across the coffee table. "Mrs. Whitfield, I've seen the garden. It's vegetables in raised beds with a small greenhouse. What codes do you think it violates?" Karen reached for her folder, pulling out highlighted ordinance excerpts: commercial agriculture in residential zones, public assembly without permits, environmental impact without assessment, traffic and parking violations during organized events. "It's a backyard garden with neighbors helping out," Officer Martinez said gently. "Mrs. Whitfield, the fire marshal, building department, and environmental health are all required to investigate formal complaints. But they're also required to assess whether complaints are filed in good faith." "What does that mean?" "It means if you keep filing frivolous complaints against your neighbors, you could be charged with harassment." The words hit Karen like cold water. She stared at Officer Martinez, seeing the shift from gentle concern to official warning. I'm not harassing anyone. I'm protecting my neighborhood. From what? The question hung in the air between them. From what, exactly? From neighbors who wanted to grow vegetables together? From children laughing in garden beds? From the kind of organic community building that Karen had spent years trying to engineer through committees and regulations? From chaos, Karen said finally. From people who don't understand what we've built here. Officer Martinez stood slowly. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm going to give you some advice. Find something else to focus on. Take a vacation, start a hobby, volunteer somewhere. But stop filing complaints against people who are growing tomatoes. After the officer left, Karen returned to her kitchen window. The garden workday was reaching its peak. Neighbors spread across the Henderson backyard in organized clusters. Children running between projects, elderly residents supervising from folding chairs strategically placed in shaded areas. Someone had brought a portable speaker, and music drifted across the fence line, mixing with conversation and laughter. Karen's phone buzzed with a text from Richard, working all weekend. Don't wait up. She stared at the message, feeling the familiar ache of abandonment. Her husband was building cases while she was losing one. Her children lived across the country and called once a month out of duty rather than affection. Her neighbors were building community without her. Even Margaret. Chen had sent a polite but final email that morning, resigning from the HOA board. Karen was completely alone, but alone didn't mean powerless. She opened her laptop and began typing, her fingers moving across the keyboard with renewed purpose. If the city wouldn't enforce existing regulations, if the police thought her concerns were frivolous, if her neighbors wanted to destroy everything she'd built in favor of vegetables and sentiment, then she would take the fight to a higher level. The letter to the Westfield Township Board of Supervisors was 6 pages long, meticulously documented, and devastatingly comprehensive. Karen outlined a pattern of regulatory noncompliance, questioned the adequacy of permit review processes, and raised concerns about liability exposure for the township. She attached photos, copies of city codes, precedent cases from other municipalities, and a detailed argument that the Henderson Garden constituted a public use of private property that required special permits and safety oversight. But the real weapon was her final paragraph. As a longtime resident and community leader, I am prepared to attend every board meeting, file formal appeals of any permit approvals, and pursue legal action to protect the residential character of our neighborhood. The Henderson Project represents a dangerous precedent that could transform residential areas into unregulated agricultural zones with significant safety, environmental, and liability implications. I respectfully request immediate intervention. To prevent further deterioration of municipal oversight responsibilities, it was a threat wrapped in legal languages, admit to my authority, or face years of bureaucratic warfare. Karen printed 3 copies, sealed them in envelopes, and drove to the township building to hand-deliver them personally. The weekend security guard looked puzzled as she insisted on time-stamped receipts, but Karen wanted absolute documentation of when her escalation officially began. On the drive home, she passed the Henderson house and saw the garden workday winding down. Neighbors were cleaning tools, children were being called away from their games, and people were loading folding chairs and empty coolers into their cars. The scene looked like the end of a successful block party, tired but satisfied people saying goodbye with promises to return soon. David Sterling was still. The Westfield Township Board meeting on Tuesday night was standing room only, first in the building's history. Karen arrived 40 minutes early to claim a front row seat, her briefcase loaded with additional documentation she'd gathered over the weekend. Legal precedents from neighboring townships, soil contamination studies, traffic impact analyses, and photographs taken with telephoto lenses that made the Henderson Garden look like an industrial farming operation. But as residents filed into the chamber, Karen realized she'd miscalculated again. The crowd wasn't there to support her complaint, they were there to defend the garden. Linda and Tom Henderson sat 2 rows behind her, flanked by what looked like every neighbor from Maple Grove Lane and beyond. Children clutched hand-drawn signs reading "Save Our Garden" and "Plants Are Friends." Elderly residents wore matching T-shirts that said "Community Grows Here." Even teenagers who normally wouldn't be caught dead at a government meeting filled the back rows, many live streaming the proceedings on their phones. Karen turned to survey the room and felt her blood chill. David Sterling sat in the third row, architectural drawings rolled under his arm, looking every inch the professional expert witness. Mrs. Kowalski had brought what appeared to be homemade cookies for the entire board. The Nguyen twins held a poster showing before and after photos of the Henderson backyard, the empty neglected pool versus the thriving garden beds. They'd organized a counter-campaign in less than 4 days. Board Chairman Robert Kellerman called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. sharp. His weathered face showing the resignation of a man who'd clearly been briefed on the evening's drama. Karen had known Bob for 12 years. He'd spoken at 2 HOA meetings and always responded promptly to her correspondence about municipal services. "We have several items on tonight's agenda," Chairman Kellerman announced, "but I understand there's significant community interest in Item 7, a resident complaint regarding property use at 1247 Maple Grove Lane." "Mr. Chairman," Karen stood, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber, "I request permission to present my concerns first, as the complainant." "Mrs. Whitfield, you'll have your opportunity. But given the level of community interest, I think we should hear from township staff first. Planning Director Sarah Walsh will provide background." Sarah Walsh was a woman in her 30s, with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd spent years navigating political landmines. She approached the podium, carrying a thick folder and an expression of barely controlled frustration. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Planning Department has received multiple complaints regarding a residential garden project at 1247 Maple Grove Lane. We've conducted a comprehensive review of all permits, zoning compliance, and regulatory requirements." Karen felt her confidence building. A comprehensive review would reveal the violations she'd documented, the regulatory oversights, the dangerous precedent of allowing community use of private property. "Our findings are straightforward," Director Walsh continued. "The Henderson property is zoned R1 residential. The current use as a private garden with occasional neighbor participation is entirely compliant with all municipal codes. No permits are required for residential gardening activities. No environmental reviews are necessary for small-scale vegetable cultivation. No traffic studies are warranted for informal neighborhood gatherings." Karen's heart stopped. "That's impossible," she said, her voice carrying farther than intended. Chairman Kellerman gavelled for order. "Mrs. Whitfield, you'll have your chance to speak." "Furthermore," Director Walsh continued, "our inspection yesterday revealed a designed, properly maintained garden that enhances rather than detracts from neighborhood character. The complaints appear to be based on misunderstandings of municipal regulations, misunderstandings." The word hit Karen like a slap. She'd spent days researching codes, building her case, documenting violations. She wasn't misunderstanding anything. She was protecting her community from people who didn't understand what they were destroying. "Mrs. Whitfield," Chairman Kellerman called, "you have 5 minutes to present your concerns." Karen approached the podium on unsteady legs, her briefcase feeling heavier with each step. The chamber fell silent except for the buzz of fluorescent lights and the soft clicking of phone cameras recording her every movement. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, board members." Karen's voice was steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I've lived on Maple Grove Lane for 15 years. In that time, I've dedicated myself to maintaining the standards that make our neighborhood special. Property values, aesthetic harmony, community stabilities aren't abstract concepts. They're the foundation of what we've built together." She clicked to her first slide, a photo of the Henderson pool in its prime. "This is what we're losing, a beautiful, valuable amenity that enhanced every property in our neighborhood. Replaced by," she clicked again, showing the garden construction at its most chaotic moment, "agricultural activities that fundamentally alter the residential character we've worked to preserve." A murmur ran through the crowd, but not the supportive kind Karen had expected. She could hear whispered conversations, see heads shaking in disagreement. "The issue isn't gardening," Karen continued, her voice rising. "The issue is precedent. If we allow one property owner to transform their backyard into a community farm, what prevents others from establishing workshops, hosting regular events, creating noise and traffic that disrupts our residential peace because it's vegetables, not a factory?" Someone called from the audience. Chairman Kellerman gavelled for order. "Please continue, Mrs. Whitfield." The The garden project includes shared tools, organized workdays, community meetings, and planned harvest festivals. This constitutes commercial or public use of private property that requires special permits. Liability insurance and environmental review. Karen clicked through her documentation traffic counts during the workday. Photos of excessive parking, evidence of unregulated composting activities. Each slide felt increasingly desperate, her arguments more strained. "I'm not trying to prevent gardening," she concluded. "I'm trying to protect the careful balance that makes Maple Grove Lane the most desirable address in Westfield Township. I'm asking you to enforce the same standards that preserve our community's character and value." As Karen returned to her seat, the chamber remained silent. No applause, no supportive murmurs, just the uncomfortable quiet that followed a performance everyone wished hadn't happened. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," Chairman Kellerman said. "Now we'll hear from other residents." Linda Henderson approached the podium with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent her career as a middle school principal managing difficult situations. "Mr. Chairman, board members, neighbors," Linda began, her voice warm and clear. "3 weeks ago, my husband and I made a decision to remove our unused swimming pool and create something that would bring our community together. We had no idea it would generate this level of attention." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. "But I'm grateful for the conversation because it's helped clarify what kind of neighborhood we want to live in. Do we want a place where people are afraid to plant flowers without checking regulations first? Where neighbors spy on each other and report violations? Where community building is treated as a threat to property values?" Karen felt heat rising in her cheeks. Linda was twisting everything, making legitimate concerns sound petty and obsessive. "Or do we want a place where children learn where food comes from? Where elderly neighbors share gardening wisdom with teenagers? Where families work together on projects that benefit everyone?" Linda clicked to her own slideshow photos from the weekend workday, showing neighbors of all ages working side by side, children laughing in garden beds, elderly residents sharing stories while shelling. The images were warm, natural, full of genuine joy. "Karen Whitfield has worked hard for our neighborhood," Linda continued, her voice taking on a note of sadness. "But somewhere along the way, she forgot that neighborhoods aren't about property. Values, they're about people." The chamber erupted in applause. Karen sat frozen as neighbors she'd known for years clapped enthusiastically for a vision that explicitly rejected everything she'd built. "The garden isn't changing our neighborhoods. Character," Linda concluded, "it's revealing what that character could be if we focused on connection instead of control." As Linda returned to her seat, Chairman Kellerman called for additional comments. One by one, neighbors stood to speak in favor of the garden. Mrs. Kowalski talked about how the project had brought her grandchildren to visit more often. David Sterling explained the architectural principles behind sustainable community design. The Nguyen twins described the science lessons they were learning through hands-on gardening. Each testimony felt like a nail in the coffin of Karen's campaign, but worse than that, they sounded genuinely happy. These people weren't just defending the garden, they were celebrating a transformation that had happened without her, despite her, in opposition to everything she'd tried to create. Then Margaret Chen approached the podium. Karen's oldest ally, her most faithful supporter, the woman who'd helped enforce every regulation and attended every meeting for 7 years. Margaret looked directly at Karen as she began to speak. "I've known Karen Whitfield